Hey guys, tonight we step into a world drenched in gold, a place where masks gleamed brighter than the desert sun, but hid stories that were anything but perfect. Picture yourself wandering through a tomb lit only by flickering torchlight, shadows, dancing across walls painted with gods and pharaohs larger than life. Then, suddenly, you catch a glimpse of a face staring back at you, a golden mask, flawless and serene. But you know deep down that the body beneath it tells a very different tale. You probably won't survive this if you were hoping ancient Egypt was all glitter and no grime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and the time where you are right now. I love seeing who's listening in from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trace your fingers along the cool edge of Tutankhamun's mask, the iconic masterpiece hammered from solid gold, inlaid with lapis and carnelian. To the ancient eye, this wasn't just decoration, it was a divine disguise. The mask was meant to turn a mortal ruler into Osiris himself, the god of the afterlife. The smooth features, the symmetrical lines, the eternal Kamel sculpted, to convince both the living and the gods that here lay perfection. Yet the truth, tucked beneath layers of linen and resin, was often far less flattering. When CT scans finally pierced through the gold facade, archaeologists discovered signs of broken bones, club feet, and genetic disorders. Imagine expecting to meet a god and instead finding a very fragile human body. Historians still argue whether those flaws were the result of inbreeding, accidents, or assassination attempts. It's a bit like meeting your favorite Instagram influencer in person and realizing filters have been working overtime. Golden masks also had another, darker purpose. They disguised injuries, diseases, or even brutal deaths. One pharaoh might have succumbed to malaria, another to a chariot crash, another possibly to a blade in the back, but in the tomb, all were given the same serene makeover, their imperfections smoothed away, their mortality covered in shining metal. The mask said, "Don't worry, everything is perfect." The mummy whispered, "Actually, not so much." And yet, the artistry of those masks is undeniable. When Howard Carter peeled back the wrappings of King Tut's burial chamber in 1922, he gasped not at a diseased skeleton, but at that impossible gleam of eternity. The discovery shook the world, but later studies peeled away the glamour, revealing evidence of burns on Tut's corpse, possibly from a chemical reaction during hasty embalming. Imagine your eternal rest turning into a literal fire hazard. Not exactly the godlike exit you'd hope for. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Pharaohs spent their lives projecting an image of invincibility, their afterlives choreographed to the last amulet. Yet under every flawless golden mask was a vulnerable body that bore the marks of human suffering. Arthritis, dental abscesses, parasites, if gods ever had bad days. These guys were having them all at once, still, even knowing that, you can't help but marvel. As you stare at the mask, it reflects back not just light, but power, propaganda, and a desperate attempt to control the narrative. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a press release. The king is divine, perfect, immortal. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the truth was stitched together with bandages and prayers. And here's the strangest twist: some masks weren't even made specifically for the dead ruler. Archaeologists found evidence that certain burial items were recycled from other tombs. Yes, even pharaohs had to deal with second-hand goods. Imagine strutting into eternity wearing someone else's face. Historians still debate whether this was due to sudden deaths, budget cuts, or a simple case of no one will notice under all this gold. So, when you see those museum displays today, shimmering under climate-controlled glass, remember, they're both masterpieces and masks, both truth and lie. They tell us as much about what the ancients wanted us to see as about what they desperately wanted to hide. And with that golden smile burned into your imagination, you step deeper into the shadows of Egypt, where the truth beneath the surface only gets stranger. You shuffle forward, still picturing that serene golden mask. But now your gaze drifts to the body that lay beneath it, Tutankhamun himself, the boy king who reigned for only a decade, yet somehow managed to outshine every other pharaoh in fame. His story is the kind of bedtime tale that starts like a fairy tale and ends with a grim riddle. Imagine inheriting the throne of Egypt at around 9 years old. You were barely old enough to tie your sandals without help, and suddenly the weight of an entire kingdom sat on your shoulders. You'd expect to be remembered as a child king. But Tut's real secret wasn't his age, it was the tragic state of his body. When CT scans and DNA studies hit his remains in the early 2000s, the shocking reality rolled out. Tutankhamun suffered from a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and possibly scoliosis. No, he wasn't striding heroically through battlefields as his tomb art suggested. He was more likely hobbling with a cane. In fact, archaeologists found over 130 walking sticks buried with him, like an eternal insurance policy for bad knees. It's hard not to smirk at the thought of Egypt's mighty warrior king limping through eternity, with a collection of fancy crutches. And then comes the question of his death. You've probably heard the theories. Murdered by a political rival, struck down in a chariot accident, or felled by malaria. Historians still argue whether the fracture in his skull was a blow from an assassin, or simply the result of sloppy embalming. CT scans show bone fragments that look suspiciously like damage inflicted after death. Others point to the shattered ribs, which some believe came from a violent accident, while another camp suggests a chemical fire cooked him inside the coffin. Honestly, Tut's afterlife sounds like the world's worst choose-your-own-adventure book, where every ending is tragic. But what really makes Tut fascinating is that he wasn't supposed to be remembered at all. He was the son of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who turned Egypt's religion upside down by worshipping the sun disk Aten. When Tut took the throne, his advisors made him restore the old gods. But that political back and forth left him as a puppet king in the hands of ambitious priests and generals. He should have been a footnote. Instead, his almost intact tomb, discovered in 1922, became the most famous archaeological find of the 20th century. That twist of fate means we know more about his sandals, his socks, and even his lunchbox than about many other rulers who reigned for half a century. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Among Tut's possessions was a dagger made not from earthly iron, but from meteoric iron, a blade literally forged from a chunk of space rock. You can almost picture him limping around palace halls with a cane in one hand and a cosmic dagger in the other. Not quite Marvel superhero material, but still pretty epic. Historians still debate whether that meteorite steel was symbolic of divine power, or just an exotic flex to impress visiting dignitaries, and yet, for all the splendor of his burial, Tutankhamun's body tells a tale of fragility, maybe even despair. The DNA results showed his parents were siblings, which probably explains his array of health issues. The royal family's obsession with keeping the bloodline pure backfired in ways you could literally see in his bones. Think of it as the most extreme example of family drama ruins everything. But Tut's tragedy became his immortality. His youthful face, reconstructed from forensic scans, stares back at you with haunting vulnerability. Not the polished god of the golden mask, but a teenager with crooked teeth and fragile bones, carried into the afterlife by the sheer luck of not being looted. And maybe that's the real shocker, the pharaoh most people think of when they hear ancient Egypt was a boy whose life was short, painful, and manipulated. Yet he somehow achieved eternal fame. You step away from his broken body and feel a shiver. Egypt's greatest treasure was never perfection, it was the human flaws they tried so desperately to hide. You leave Tutankhamun's fragile bones behind and wander into the perfumed chambers of the royal court, where the air is thick with incense, honey, and believe it or not, crocodile dung. Yes, you heard that right. The pharaohs, for all their golden power, relied on some truly eyebrow-raising beauty hacks and medical tricks. You imagine yourself slipping into a scene straight out of an ancient spa, except the treatment menu looks less like a luxury retreat and more like the world's weirdest chemistry set. For starters, the Egyptians adored cosmetics not just for style, but for health and magic. Thick black eyeliner, known as kohl, framed the eyes of both kings and queens. It wasn't just a fashion statement. The lead compounds in the mixture actually helped ward off eye infections by stimulating the body's natural immune response. So, yes, while Cleopatra's smoky gaze might have seduced Roman generals, it was also fighting off pink eye. Imagine Sephora marketing that today. Get the smoldering look and kiss conjunctivities. Goodbye. But eyeliner was just the tip of the beauty iceberg. Royal women slathered their skin with ointments of honey, milk, and animal fat to keep it smooth under the brutal desert sun. Honey wasn't just moisturizing. It was antibacterial, making it the ancient world's version of a multi-purpose miracle. Cream. Historians still argue whether some of these treatments were genuinely effective or whether their mystical healing power was more placebo than science. Either way, it's hard not to picture a pharaoh's morning routine looking like a cross between a dermatologist's office and a kitchen pantry. And then comes the infamous contraceptive recipe: crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough, rolled up and placed strategically. I'll spare you the visual. The idea was that the mixture's acidity would block conception. Modern science is divided on whether it could have worked, or whether it was just an elaborate exercise in suffering. Either way, you've got to give them credit for creativity. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen joke from earlier? Well, in pharaonic Egypt, the line between beauty product and biohazard was razor-thin perfume was another obsession. The royals blended oils of lotus, frankincense, and myrrh into scents so potent that, according to some Greek writers, a queen could be smelled before she entered the room. That sounds glamorous until you remember the Egyptian climate. Imagine layering on sticky oils while sweat trickles down your spine in 100-degree heat. Eau de Pharaoh, bold, floral, and slightly swampy. There's also a quirky tidbit about hair. Wigs were hugely popular, not just for fashion, but also for hygiene. Lice were a daily nuisance, so royals often shaved their heads completely and wore elaborate wigs made of human hair or plant fibers. Archaeologists have even found tiny combs, buried in tombs, complete with fossilized lice still lodged between the teeth. Yes, even divine rulers couldn't escape itchy scalp days. One of the more curious debates among Egyptologists centers on the infamous blue lotus. Was it a hallucinogen, an aphrodisiac, or just a pretty flower steeped in wine? Ancient art shows party scenes where nobles sniff the lotus while drinking, swaying in what looks suspiciously like a trance. Some scholars argue it was their version of a party drug. Others think it was just symbolic of rebirth and luxury. Either way, it proves the royals weren't strangers to mixing pleasure with ritual. And don't think the men skipped the glam. Pharaohs rubbed scented oils into their muscles after hunting or battle. Some even dyed their beards with henna to give them a fiery glow, despite the fact that many couldn't grow much facial hair to begin with. Picture a royal stylist gently painting a few wispy hairs on Ramses II and assuring him, very manly, "Sire, the most fascinating part is that so many of these oddball treatments had real staying power. Honey masks, herbal scrubs, even eyeliner with antimicrobial properties modern beauty brands still borrow from them, minus the reptile excrement. Yet beneath all the luxury, there's that same theme you've been noticing since Tut's mask, a desperate attempt to control the body to appear divine, flawless, untouchable, even when reality was anything but. You can almost smell the sweet perfume as you step back into the flickering torchlight of history. But now your nose wrinkles at the memory of what went into some of those jars. Divine beauty, it turns out, had some very dirty secrets. You drift from the world of perfumed oils and crocodile dung remedies into the heart of pharaonic ideology, where the line between human and divine was blurred on purpose. Imagine waking up tomorrow and being told, "Congratulations, you're no longer just you, you're now a living god, responsible for the order of the universe." That was the pharaoh's reality, at least in the carefully constructed theater of ancient Egyptian propaganda. From the moment of coronation, the king was declared the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and upon death he became Osiris, ruler of the underworld. In between, every word he spoke and every ritual he performed wasn't just political, it was cosmic maintenance. The rising sun, the flooding Nile, the harvest of grain or tide, at least in theory. To whether the pharaoh fulfilled his divine duties, that's quite a workload, especially for someone who might have been a teenager limping around with a cane. The monuments reinforced this illusion. Walk into Karnak Temple, and you'll see walls chiseled with images of pharaohs towering 3 times taller than their enemies, smiting captives with a single swing of the mace. It's a bit like history's earliest propaganda posters, bold, dramatic, and not exactly subtle. In truth, the king might not have even set foot on the battlefield. Historians still argue whether some heroic victories, like Ramses to at Kadesh, were actual triumphs or just very creative PR campaigns. And the rituals! Pharaohs spent enormous amounts of time in ceremonies designed to convince the people, and perhaps themselves, that they really were divine. The daily temple rites, feeding statues of gods, reciting spells, and presenting offerings were often carried out on the pharaoh's behalf by priests, but the symbolism always looped back to him, to the average farmer hauling baskets of onions along the Nile. The pharaoh wasn't just a king sitting in a palace, he was the reason the sun rose tomorrow. But here's the cheeky twist: not everyone bought it. Letters and graffiti survive. That suggests ordinary Egyptians could be a little skeptical. Think of it as ancient subtweets. Some inscriptions complain about heavy taxes, forced labor, or corrupt officials, hinting that people knew their living God was still a fallible human, or at least someone whose ministers could make life miserable. The propaganda may have been divine, but the daily grind was all too human. Even the pharaohs themselves sometimes struggled with the burden of divinity. Akhenaten, for example, flipped the whole system by insisting everyone worship a single god. Aten, was it genuine religious conviction or just another way to consolidate power? Historians still debate it, pointing to his odd artistic portrayals: elongated head, sagging belly, spindly limbs that may have symbolized his divine uniqueness, or, less glamorously, a medical condition. Either way, his attempt to reinvent divinity didn't exactly stick. After his death, the old gods stormed back in force, yet the divine image had staying power. Even when Egypt was ruled by foreign dynasties, Nubians, Persians, Greeks, the idea that the ruler was somehow infused with godhood continued. It wasn't just politics, it was branding. You can almost hear a royal advisor whispering, "Sire, if you don't convince the people you're a god, they might remember you're just a guy with taxes to collect." And here's a quirky detail. When pharaohs commissioned statues of themselves, they were sometimes deliberately stylized to exaggerate features like broad shoulders, calm eyes, and eternal youth. In a sense, the world's first photo filters were carved in stone. No matter how wrinkled or worn they became in life, their monuments always portrayed them as ageless perfection. Imagine if your yearbook photo could follow you for eternity with just a little divine airbrushing. So, as you picture the pharaoh striding through temple halls, surrounded by incense and chanting priests, remember that much of it was performance. Behind the smoke and mirrors, he was still human, aching bones, palace drama, and all. But for the farmers, soldiers, and scribes who looked up at his colossal statues, the illusion mattered. It wasn't about whether the pharaoh truly was a god. It was about needing to believe someone held the chaos of the universe in check. And with that thought, you step deeper into the shadows, where family secrets and dynastic strategies reveal just how far the pharaohs went to keep their divine image alive. You move deeper into the torchlit corridors of memory, and suddenly the walls whisper a truth that modern audiences often squirm to hear. The pharaohs kept their dynasties pure by marrying close relatives. Forget fairy tale romances, this was politics in its most intimate form. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters, even uncles married nieces, all to tighten the knot of divine legitimacy. To them, the throne was not just a seat of power, it was sacred DNA. And you didn't just let outsiders borrow it. Take Tutankhamun again, remember his fragile bones? Modern DNA tests show his parents were full siblings. The result, a body riddled with genetic issues, a living testimony to how keeping the family tree to compact can backfire. Historians still argue whether the royal court understood the risks, or whether the lure of godblood blinded them to the price. One thing's for sure, the ancient tabloids of palace gossip must have been spicy. But incestuous marriage wasn't just about bloodlines. It was also about symbolism. Pharaohs were the children of gods, and in myth, gods often paired with siblings. Isis with Osiris, for example. By copying divine unions, kings reinforced their own claim to divinity. In other words, if it's good enough for the gods, it's good enough for us. Imagine that justification flying at your next family reunion. Of course, not every union was so neat. Take Cleopatra II and her brother Ptolemy VIII. Their relationship devolved into one of the messiest soap operas in Egyptian history, complete with betrayals, public insults, and an actual civil war. It's one thing to argue over dinner, it's another when that dinner table spat ends with armies clashing on the Nile. And then there's Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Was she his cousin, sister? Historians still debate it. Their images in temples show a strangely affectionate couple sharing thrones, embracing under the rays of Aten, usually intimate for royal art. Whether they were genetic siblings or not, their partnership reshaped Egypt's religion for a generation, proving that inbreeding didn't dull ambition. Quirky detail, some pharaohs even staged symbolic marriages to goddesses. The king might wed Hathor or Mut in ritual texts, turning divine unions into political theatre. So, technically, a pharaoh's marriage certificate could read spouse, sister, and also a goddess. Talk about multitasking. Yet despite the glamour of keeping it in the family, there's an undercurrent of fragility in these unions. Many royal children died young, likely from genetic complications. Still, the illusion of continuity mattered more than biology. Even if the bloodline cracked, the story of divine descent had to remain unbroken. Think of it this way. Pharaohs weren't chasing romance, they were chasing eternity. Every wedding was a chess move in a long game of divine optics. But behind the gold, you find a simple truth: the cost of power was sometimes written in the frailty of the bodies it produced. You step onward, leaving the ghostly laughter of palace weddings behind, into darker chambers where wives, concubines, and rivals whispered plots that could topple gods. You tread softly now, past murals of royal weddings, into chambers where shadows lean closer and whispers sharpen into knives. The pharaoh's harem on the surface, a place of beauty, luxury, and music, was also a pressure cooker of jealousy and ambition. Behind the polished smiles of queens and secondary wives lurked plots that could change dynasties overnight. If you thought your office politics were bad, wait until you hear about palace intrigue with godhood at stake. The most famous case is the harem conspiracy against Ramses III. He ruled Egypt in the 12th century BCE, and though his monuments boasted of victories, his household told another story. One of his lesser wives, Tai, schemed to put her son Pentuer on the throne instead of the official heir. The plan involved magic wax figurines, forged documents, and a cabal of servants, scribes, and even military officers. Imagine trying to overthrow a king with both witchcraft and paperwork. It's part Game of Thrones, part office memo. Trial records, preserved on papyrus, reveal the shocking details. Dozens of conspirators were dragged into court, their testimonies scribbled down like a grim courtroom drama. Some were executed. Others were forced to take their own lives. Pentuer himself may have been strangled or allowed to commit suicide. As for Ramses III, historians still argue whether he was killed outright or merely wounded. CT scans of his mummy revealed a deep slit across his throat, hidden under layers of resin. So yes, the mighty living god likely bled out from an assassination attempt orchestrated by his own wife. Talk about a bad date night. But this wasn't an isolated scandal. Pharaohs lived surrounded by potential rivals. Secondary wives, often daughters of foreign kings, sometimes carried more political weight than the chief queen. Their children could be used as bargaining chips in succession struggles. And with dozens of kids running around the palace, the question of who inherits was never simple. You can almost hear the whispers. If only the crown prince tripped on a staircase. My son would be next. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe that even love poetry etched on Ostraka shards may have doubled as political propaganda. Lines praising a queen's beauty could mask her rising influence at court. So, while one scribe doodled verses about a woman's lotus-like lips, another might have been plotting how to make her son king. Multitasking in ancient Egypt meant writing romantic ballads with one hand and forging death warrants with the other. And let's not forget Nefertiti. Historians still debate whether she ruled as co-regent after Akhenaten's death, possibly even under a male name, if true. Her maneuvering through palace intrigue set the stage for one of Egypt's most mysterious transfers of power. Was she a loyal queen, a power-hungry schemer, or both? The jury's still out. The irony is clear. Pharaohs were hailed as divine, eternal, untouchable. Yet their greatest threats often came not from foreign invaders, but from the women brushing shoulders with them at breakfast. The same silken halls that echoed with music and laughter also hid whispered betrayals, and scribes sharpening papyrus knives dot as you step away from these chambers. The flicker of torchlight catches on dagger-shaped shadows. Ahead looms the vast outline of pyramids, monuments that seem eternal but whose secrets about their builders are just as surprising as the palace whispers you've just left behind. You blink, and the courtly whispers fade into the vast glare of desert sun. Rising before you, jagged against the horizon, stand the pyramids, those colossal mountains of stone that seem too perfect, too precise to have been built by mere mortals. For centuries, travelers spun wild stories. Perhaps slaves were whipped into stacking blocks under a merciless sun. Or maybe aliens lent a hand with laser levels. But the truth, as the sand quietly insists, is stranger and more human than the myths. Archaeologists have uncovered entire workers' villages beside the Great Pyramids, complete with bakeries, breweries, and surprisingly cozy dormitories. These weren't miserable slaves dragged from conquered lands. They were skilled laborers, farmers drafted during the Nile's flood season when their fields lay underwater. In exchange, they were housed, fed, and even given medical care. Skeletons show healed fractures, meaning injured workers were looked after rather than tossed aside. Imagine breaking your leg on the job and still getting ancient Egyptian health care. Honestly, better than some modern workplaces. And the diet. Workers consumed massive amounts of bread, onions, and beer, so much beer that vats big enough to bathe in were brewed daily. Think of it as the ancient world's version of an energy drink sponsorship. Build a pyramid, get free beer. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists even found cattle bones showing the workers ate beef regularly, a luxury for ordinary Egyptians. It turns out pyramid building was fueled by carbs and barbecue. But how did they move those blocks? Historians still argue whether ramps, sledges, or water lubrication did the trick. One wall painting shows workers pouring water before dragging a massive statue, suggesting they knew wet sand cut friction. It's basically the first documented life hack. Sprinkle some water, save your back. Forget aliens, it was physics, teamwork, and ingenuity. The builders also left graffiti inside hidden chambers, casual doodles, and team names like the Friends of Khufu. Imagine modern construction crews scrawling Team Bob rules inside the walls of a skyscraper. These rough sketches remind us that real people, not nameless slaves, carved these wonders. And yes, some graffiti pokes fun at overseers, proving workplace sarcasm is as old as humanity itself. Yet for all the evidence, the image of slave-built pyramids lingers, partly thanks to Greek writers like Herodotus, who preferred dramatic tales over reality. Hollywood didn't help either. But the truth is far more compelling. Thousands of skilled laborers organized into rotating crews, building monuments not through chains, but through pride, duty, and the promise of eternal glory. Quirky detail: some blocks bear red chalk marks with delivery instructions like ancient post-it notes. Imagine a foreman grumbling, "This block goes to the north face, you idiots," even 1,500 years ago. The sense of daily logistics, of planning and error. makes these monuments feel less like alien mysteries and more like the world's most ambitious construction site. So, as you tilt your head back to take in the Great Pyramid, remember that it's not just a tomb, it's a monument to human collaboration. Every block whispers of hands that pushed, backs that strained, and families that waited at home for their sons to return with stories of working on the king's eternal house. You take a breath, the desert heat pressing on your shoulders, and step closer into the pyramid's shadow. Within them lie the mummies, some destined for journeys stranger than eternity itself. You duck into the cool shadow of the pyramid, and suddenly you're surrounded not by the scent of sand and sweat, but by the faint, dusty smell of something. For stranger, embalmed flesh, the Egyptians perfected the art of preserving bodies for eternity. Yet ironically, many of those carefully wrapped mummies ended up anywhere but their intended tombs. Their afterlife journeys didn't stop at the gates of the underworld. They continued into the drawing rooms, laboratories, and even the medicine cabinets of later centuries. Picture this: Victorian gentlemen in top hats gathering at a party, sipping tea while a hired expert unwraps an actual ancient mummy for entertainment. Yes, mummy unwrapping became a fad in the 19th century, part macabre science show, part parlor amusement. Guests would ooh and ah's linen peeled away, revealing dried skin, amulets, or the occasional whiff of resin. Imagine ruining your evening gown because someone sneezed out 3,000-year-old embalming dust. Even stranger, ground-up mummies were sold as powder called *mummy*, marketed as a miracle medicine from the Middle Ages onward. People swallowed it, mixed it with wine, or rubbed it on wounds. Historians still argue whether anyone truly believed it worked, or whether it was just a profitable scam. Either way, thousands of ancient corpses vanished into apothecary jars. Talk about rest in pieces. And the trade didn't stop there. Some mummies ended up fueling actual furnaces. In the 19th century, travelers reported that Egyptian locals would strip ancient tombs for wood and, in desperate times, even burn mummy remains as fuel. Imagine spending your life preparing for eternal glory, only to become kindling for someone else's dinner. Dark humor, yes, but also a reminder of how fragile eternity can be. A quirky tidbit: artists in Renaissance Europe sometimes used a pigment called mummy brown, made from ground-up human remains mixed with oils. Painters thought it gave depth and warmth to their colors. Next time you stand before a masterpiece in a museum, you may wonder, is that a saint on the canvas or a pharaoh underneath the brushstrokes? And yet, not all traveling mummies met grisly ends. Some sparked genuine curiosity that fueled modern science. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 triggered a craze for Egyptomania. Flooding Europe with artifacts, including mummies, scholars began to catalogue, sketch, and eventually dissect them in the name of archaeology. That shift away from mystical relic to scientific specimen helped birth the field of Egyptology. So in a twisted way, pharaohs got their wish. They became immortal, though maybe not in the way they imagined. The most haunting part is how some mummies, once symbols of royal immortality, ended up forgotten in museum basements or mislabeled in dusty crates. One royal mummy was even found used as a prop in a carnival sideshow. Picture the afterlife review board. You were meant to rule alongside Osiris. Instead, you entertained tourists next to the bearded lady. Still, modern science is giving these wanderers a second dignity. CT scans, DNA testing, and isotope analysis now reveal details their golden masks never told us. Diets heavy in beer and bread, diseases like tuberculosis, even travel patterns locked into their teeth enamel. Pharaohs and commoners alike are finally speaking again in the language of data. So, as you stand before one of these shrouded figures, you realize the real shock isn't that they traveled so far from home, it's that they remain still whispering across millennia, even after being ground into pigment, brewed into medicine, or paraded in parlors. Their eternity, though disrupted, has outlasted their tombs. The torchlight flickers, and you step past these restless travelers toward an even stranger sight, the endless rows of animal mummies where divinity met the fur, feathers, and scales of Egypt's sacred creatures. You step deeper into the dim corridors and suddenly the air seems crowded not with people, but with animals. Shelves upon shelves of tiny linen bundles stretch before you, each one shaped like a cat, an ibis, or even a crocodile. At first, it looks like some ancient pet cemetery, but the truth is even stranger. The Egyptians mummified animals on an industrial scale. Cats, of course, were the stars. You picture sleek felines, pampered in palaces, lounging on laps of queens, their purring treated as divine music. Cats were sacred to Bastet, the goddess of protection and motherhood. Killing one, even by accident, could land you in serious trouble. Ancient writers claimed mobs would riot if someone harmed a cat. Try explaining that at your neighborhood hoe meeting, and when cats died, they weren't just buried in the backyard. They were embalmed, wrapped carefully in linen, and sometimes placed in miniature coffins. Archaeologists have uncovered cat necropolises with thousands of tiny mummies, stacked like shelves in a warehouse. But it wasn't just cats. Ibises, associated with the god Thoth, were mummified by the millions. Excavations at Saqqara unearthed entire catacombs filled, wall to wall, with bird bundles. Crocodiles, too, linked with the god Sobek, were embalmed in staggering numbers. Some were small hatchlings, others giant beasts curled into eternal sleep. Imagine wandering into a cavern lined with crocodile mummies, basically the world's least cozy zoo. And here's the twist. Many of these animals weren't beloved pets but ritual offerings. Worshippers would buy a mummified animal at a temple, present it to the god, and send it off into sacred burial chambers. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of buying a candle at a church, or lighting incense at a shrine. Except your candle has feathers, fur, and fangs. Historians still argue whether worshippers believed each animal carried a piece of divine spirit, or whether it was more about showing devotion through sheer volume. A quirky tidbit: CT scans have revealed that not all animal mummies actually contain full animals. Some are just linen stuffed with bones, feathers, or even mud. It's like buying a souvenir and finding out it's mostly packing material. Was it fraud, or just symbolic efficiency? Scholars remain divided, but you can almost hear an ancient temple merchant shrugging. Hey, it's the thought that counts. The economic scale of this practice boggles the mind. Estimates suggest millions of animals were bred, killed, and embalmed for offerings. That means temples operated more like production factories, with dedicated farms raising ibises and cats just to meet demand. If you thought Amazon warehouses were intense, imagine one where the prime product is freshly mummified kittens. And yet, there's a tenderness, too. Some animal mummies show signs of careful preservation, painted faces, or even jewelry. To their owners, these creatures weren't just sacrifices, they were companions, protectors, or spiritual guides. The line between devotion and business was blurred, much like the line between gods and humans. So, as you stand in the half-light of this endless animal vault, you realize Egypt's obsession with eternity wasn't reserved for kings. Even cats got a shot at forever, their paws wrapped neatly in linen, their spirits prowling through the afterlife. But among these bundles also lurked stories of fraud, faith, and further secrets wrapped just as tightly as the animals themselves. You turn away from the silent feline gaze of a mummified cat and step toward tombs where darker whispers linger, tales of curses, vengeance, and unlucky explorers who dared disturb eternity. You edge forward, torchlight licking the carved walls, and the silence thickens. Here, every footstep feels like it trespasses, every breath risks waking something that prefers to stay asleep. For centuries, stories of tomb curses wrapped Egypt's treasures in a haze of fear. You can almost hear a modern movie trailer voice whisper, "They opened the tomb, and they were never the same again." The most infamous case is, of course, the tomb of Tutankhamun, when Howard Carter uncovered the boy king's resting place in 1922. Rumors spread like wildfire that anyone who disturbed it would face doom. Just months later, Lord Carnarvon the expedition's wealthy backer died suddenly from a mosquito bite that turned septic. Newspapers screamed about the curse of the Pharaoh. Dogs howled in the night. Lights flickered across Cairo. And gossip insisted that supernatural vengeance was loose in the world. Never mind that the rest of the excavation team lived long, healthy lives while let facts spoil a good ghost story. Historians still argue whether the curse was pure media hype, a coincidence, or perhaps the effect of toxic molds and bacteria sealed in tombs for millennia. But Tut's curse is just the start. Ancient tomb walls themselves sometimes carried warnings: death shall come swiftly to those who disturb this place. Chilling words, carved in stone, aimed less at foreign explorers and more at would-be Egyptian grave robbers. To a thief eyeing gold, it must have felt like a divine dare. Did they believe it? Maybe. But the reality is that looting continued regardless, curses or not. Desperation often speaks louder than divine threats. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, some showmen in Europe claimed to own cursed mummies that brought bad luck wherever they traveled. One tale even insists a mummy ended up aboard the Titanic, and that its dark aura helped doom the ship. Spoiler alert, the story isn't true, but it sold newspapers. Imagine blaming your shipwreck on an Egyptian princess rather than on icebergs. Yet, curses weren't just about scaring thieves, they were about reinforcing the pharaoh's divine aura. If you were a farmer trudging past a tomb, reading that a king's spirit could strike you dead, it reminded you of the eternal power of rulers. Even in death, their authority lingered, stronger than any living scribe. It's a reminder that belief itself can be the most powerful spell of all. Modern science offers a sober counterpoint. Some researchers suggest that exposure to ancient mold spores, bat guano, or sealed gases could cause illness in tomb openers. The idea of a biological curse adds a practical twist. Maybe the ancients didn't need mystical powers, just centuries of microbial build-up. Historians still debate whether that could explain deaths like Carnarvon's, or whether it's stretching the science. Still, you can't help but feel a chill when you imagine descending into a sealed chamber, breaking a plaster wall that hasn't been touched for 3,000 years and feeling the rush of air against your face. In that moment, curse or not, you've awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed. So when you next hear a story about the mummy's curse, remember, it's part superstition, part biology, and part clever storytelling. But down here, in the flickering dark, with painted eyes watching from the walls, you can't quite laugh it off. You hurry on, deeper into the labyrinth, where medicine jars and healing scrolls reveal that Egyptians weren't just obsessed with curses, they also pioneered remedies far ahead of their time. You follow the tunnel deeper, and a torchlight glints off rows of jars, neatly ranged like an ancient pharmacy. This isn't just the realm of curses and gold, it's the place where Egyptians tried to keep their fragile bodies alive. Medicine, for them, was a curious mix of science, magic, and downright weird recipes. Yet buried in those scrolls and jars are treatments that still surprise modern doctors. One of the most impressive was honey. Egyptians used it liberally on wounds, burns, and infections. They didn't know about bacteria, but honey's natural. Antibacterial properties kept injuries clean and promoted healing. Picture a battlefield doctor dabbing honey onto a soldier's cut while whispering an incantation to ward off evil spirits. The spell may have been optional, but the honey actually worked. Historians still argue whether Egyptians recognized its medical value consciously, or if they simply trusted in tradition that happened to align with science. Then there's moldy bread. Yes, they applied it to wounds. Sounds revolting until you realize mold produces penicillin-like substances. It's as if they stumbled onto antibiotics centuries before Fleming. Imagine an ancient healer leaning over a patient. Good news. We'll just smear this fuzzy bread on your leg. Today that would land you a 1-star Yelp review. But back then it probably saved lives. Of course, not every treatment sounds so smart. Remedies included crushed beetles, lizard blood, and even powdered mummies. Yes, again. One papyrus recommends mixing ground donkey liver with honey for eye problems. Another prescribes placing half an onion up the nose for headaches. You can't help but picture a pharaoh pacing the palace, one nostril stuffed like a bazaar party. Trick, waiting for relief. Still, Egyptian doctors were surprisingly systematic. The *Ebers Papyrus *, one of the oldest medical documents we have, lists over 700 remedies and surgical instructions. It describes pulse diagnosis, herbal treatments, and even procedures for resetting broken bones. Some texts read more like magical spells, but others show keen observation. Broken arms were splintered, dislocated shoulders set back into place. They knew how to check for pregnancy using barley and wheat seeds urine tests. In a sense, quirky, yes, but sometimes effective. They also had a concept of specialization. Dentists of the pharaoh dealt with the nightmare of toothaches caused by bread full of stone-ground grit. Other healers treated stomach issues, while temple priests handled spiritual maladies. The blending of magic and medicine was seamless. A doctor might prescribe a poultice while also chanting to banish demons. To Egyptians, health wasn't just physical, it was tied to cosmic balance, to *more single quotes at *. And here's something eerie. Mummified bodies reveal evidence of surgeries like trepanation, drilling into the skull, and even prosthetics, like artificial toes made from wood and leather. Were these cosmetic or functional? Historians still debate, but it suggests they valued not just life, but dignity in death. Quirky tidbit, they sometimes used lettuce as an aphrodisiac, associating it with the god Men. Imagine being prescribed eat more salad as the cure for your marital woes. On the flip side, too much beer was blamed for stomach upset, proof that hangovers have been around since forever. As you linger among these jars, you sense the duality, treatments that genuinely worked sitting beside recipes that sound like bad dares. Yet behind it all was the same desperate drive we feel today, the hope to cheat pain, prolong life, and hold mortality at bay. You step past the shelves, into the chamber of another riddle, the body of Akhenaten, the heretic king, whose very form still fuels debates. Was he sick, deformed, or simply reinventing what it meant to be divine? You wander into a chamber lit by faint, otherworldly rays carved into stone, the rays of Aten, the sun disk that Akhenaten worshipped above all else. His statues stare down at you, faces long and narrow, bellies round, hips wide. They don't look like the chiseled, muscular pharaohs you saw earlier. Instead, Akhenaten's body is strange, almost alien. For centuries, his unusual form has sparked more debate than perhaps any other ruler in Egypt. Some argue he truly suffered from medical conditions. The elongated skull, drooping chin, and swollen belly suggest disorders like Marfan syndrome or Froelich syndrome. Historians still argue whether these features were genuine deformities, exaggerated by artists, or symbolic choices. Was Akhenaten's body frail, or was it propaganda carved in limestone? Because here's the twist. Akhenaten wasn't just changing religion, he was reinventing kingship itself. He abandoned the gods of old, shut down temples to Ammon, and declared Aten the one true god. This was a revolution in a land where thousands of years of tradition insisted pharaohs were intermediaries between many gods and humanity. Imagine waking up and finding out your leader cancelled every holiday, closed every church, and said, "From now on, we only worship my personal son." Not exactly a crowd pleaser. The art of the Amarna period reflects this upheaval. Akhenaten is shown not as a warrior smiting enemies, but as a family man, sitting tenderly with Nefertiti and their daughters under Aten's rays. It's startlingly intimate compared to the stiff, formal art of earlier dynasties. Was he trying to show vulnerability, humanity, or perhaps divine androgyny? Some scholars think the odd proportions in his statues were deliberate symbols, merging male and female traits to emphasize his godlike uniqueness. Others think the sculptors were just following orders to glorify whatever quirks their ruler actually had. And then there's the mystery of his burial. Unlike other pharaohs, Akhenaten's mummy hasn't been definitively identified. Some believe a body found in Tomb 5-5 in the Valley of the Kings may be his, but its condition is poor, its identity debated. Was it Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, another relative? The DNA evidence points toward Akhenaten being Tutankhamun's father, but the puzzle pieces don't all fit neatly, even in death. He refuses to give up his secrets. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some fringe theories once suggested Akhenaten was so unusual he might have been an alien visitor, or at least depicted like one. Obviously, historians roll their eyes at that. But the fact it even became a theory shows how odd his portrayal was compared to every other king. You almost expect him to beam up to a spaceship rather than sail on the solar bark. Nefertiti adds. Another layer of intrigue. Was she merely the beautiful queen? Or did she rule as co-regent after his death? Some evidence suggests she took on a male throne name, effectively becoming Pharaoh. Others believe her power was erased by successors, desperate to restore the old gods. Either way, the Amarna period was a short, turbulent experiment. Undone quickly after Akhenaten's death, the temples to Aten were dismantled, statues smashed, names chiseled out. His religious revolution was buried literally and figuratively by those who came after. Yet, despite all attempts to erase him, Akhenaten remains one of Egypt's most fascinating rulers. His vision, whether born of genuine devotion, political ambition, or personal frailty, forced Egypt to question the very nature of divinity, and his strange statues, staring with half smiles and heavy eyelids, still leave you unsettled, as if he's whispering across the centuries, "You haven't figured me out yet." You turn from his oddly shaped gaze and step forward into a grand hall where another secret waits, not about deformity or disappearance, but about a queen who defied the rules and dared to take the throne herself. You step into a hall where the walls still bear faint traces of red paint, and towering columns rise like trees in a stone forest. At the far end, a queen gazes down at you, not soft, not secondary, but proud, commanding, dressed in the regalia of a king. This is Hatshepsut, the woman who decided being queen wasn't enough. She crowned herself Pharaoh, took the throne named Motker, and ruled Egypt for over 20 years. Imagine the audacity. In a world where the throne was guarded fiercely by tradition, Hatshepsut didn't wait for permission. She donned the foal's beard, the broad shoulders, the kilt, and the crowns. In temple carvings, she is shown as a man because pharaohs were supposed to look that way, but the inscription still carried her female pronouns. It was a balancing act. A woman cloaked in male imagery, but refusing to erase her own identity. Completely, historians still argue whether this was a clever political strategy, a necessity for legitimacy, or a sign she truly saw herself as transcending gender roles. Her reign itself was no footnote. Far from it, Egypt flourished. She launched ambitious building projects, including the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, its terraces rising gracefully from the cliffs. She reopened trade routes long neglected, most famously sending an expedition to Punt, a mysterious land likely in East Africa. The reliefs in her temple show ships loaded with gold, ivory, incense trees, and even exotic animals. One quirky detail: those incense trees were actually transported back to Egypt and replanted, making her one of the earliest rulers to try international landscaping. Imagine showing off your new garden and casually mentioning the saplings were imported from across the Red Sea. Yet for all her success, Hatshepsut's story is tinged with betrayal. After her death, someone, likely her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, tried to erase her from history. Her statues were smashed, her name chiseled off monuments, her images defaced. For centuries, she was nearly invisible in the historical record. Scholars still debate whether Thutmose acted out of vengeance, political necessity, or perhaps an effort to restore order by erasing a precedent that challenged male succession. But here's the twist: the erasure wasn't complete enough. Traces survived for archaeologists to piece together her reign. Today, she's celebrated as one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers, not in spite of her gender, but because she dared to wield it differently. The irony is sharp. The attempt to erase her only made her story more compelling once rediscovered. And there's another layer: her mummy. For years, her body was missing, adding fuel to the mystery. Then, in 2007, researchers using DNA testing and a missing molar identified a previously overlooked mummy as Hatshepsut. Far from the radiant statues, she was revealed as an older woman suffering from obesity, diabetes, and cancer. A tragic contrast, yes, but also a profoundly human one. The divine king was, once again, a fragile body beneath the gold. Quirky tidbit: some of the perfume residues in jars linked to her tomb were analyzed recently, and researchers recreated the scent. The result, a strong, spicy fragrance heavy with frankincense and myrrh. Imagine inhaling the same perfume that clung to the robes of a queen-turned-king 3,000 years ago. It's history through your nose. So as you look up at Hatshepsut statues, their noses hacked off, their inscriptions scarred, you realize erasure doesn't always work. She defied convention, built wonders, opened trade, and still whispers across the millennia, "You can chip my face away, but you can't silence me." You step from her temple into the blinding sun, and the colossal shadow of Ramses rises next, Egypt's master of ego, monuments, and propaganda. The sun hits your face as you step out from Hatshepsut's quiet defiance, and immediately you're dwarfed by something much louder, Ramses II the Great. His statues rise around you like mountains with smug expressions, each one announcing, yes, I'm that important. If Hatshepsut played a clever game of legitimacy, Ramses went full throttle on spectacle. He wanted you, your children, and your children's children to remember him, and honestly, he succeeded. Known as Ramses the Great, he reigned for more than 60 years, an eternity by pharaonic standards. He built colossal temples at Abu Simbel, their seated statues staring across the Nile like stone sentinels. Each carving screams propaganda. Behold me, the living God, forever young, forever victorious. Historians still argue whether his campaigns were as glorious as he claimed, or if he simply rewrote the headlines afterward. The Battle of Kadesh is the best example. The records on his temples show him single-handedly charging into battle against the Hittites, scattering enemies like flies and emerging triumphant. In reality, the battle was likely a stalemate, maybe even a narrow escape. Yet Ramses plastered the victory across every available wall. Imagine someone losing a soccer match 1-1, then erecting billboards declaring themselves world champions. A bold move, but apparently it worked. Quirky tidbit: at Abu Simbel, the temple is designed so that twice a year, the rising sun penetrates deep into the sanctuary and lights up statues of the gods, and Ramses himself while leaving the god of darkness in shadow. That's not just architecture, that's ego set in stone. It's as if he commissioned the universe to serve as his personal spotlight. And he didn't stop there. He named cities after himself, filled them with monuments of himself, and even signed peace treaties that made sure his name came first. His reign was one long PR campaign, and every monument was a press release. Yet beneath the propaganda, there was also substance. His building projects provided work, his monuments anchored Egypt's cultural identity, and his diplomatic marriage to a Hittite princess stabilized relations after years of warfare. For all his bluster, he did leave Egypt stronger still. His obsession with scale had consequences. Later pharaohs often reused his statues, carving their own names over his. Even in antiquity, people rolled their eyes at his vanity, but his sheer determination to be remembered worked. Today, more statues of Ramses to survive than of any other pharaoh. Walk through a museum and odds are good you'll bump into his smirking stone face, his mummiads. Another twist: when modern scientists examined it, they discovered Ramses had arthritis, bad teeth, and even arteriosclerosis. The man who declared himself immortal suffered the same ailments as any ordinary person. Yet when his mummy needed conservation in the 1970s, Egypt gave him a passport occupation, king deceased. He flew to Paris for treatment, greeted with full honors. Imagine the satisfaction Ramses would have felt, still treated as royalty 3,000 years later. As you look up at his colossal likeness, you can almost hear him chuckle. See? I told you I'd be remembered. And remembered he is, though sometimes for his arrogance as much as his accomplishments. But in the end, Maybe that was the point ego big enough to last forever. You step past his looming statues, and the echoes of battle horns fade into the distant clatter of wheels and hooves. Ahead lies the reality behind all those reliefs, pharaohs. At war, where blood, dust, and chariots told a less glamorous story than the walls suggest. You leave Ramses II's smug grin etched in stone and follow the distant rumble of wheels, the thud of hooves, the cries of men. The desert air thickens with the heat of battle, and suddenly you're standing at the edge of a pharaoh's war camp. The polished reliefs in temples show the king charging gloriously into combat, bowstring drawn, enemies scattering like reeds in the Nile wind, but peeled back the carved perfection. And war under the pharaohs was a lot more dust, sweat, and chaos than those neat hieroglyphs admit. Egypt's army was no ragtag band. By the new kingdom, it was highly organized, divided into divisions named after gods Ammon, Ra, Ta, Seth. Soldiers trained with bows, spears, axes, and the crown jewel of Egyptian warfare, the chariot. Picture sleek, two-wheeled machines pulled by horses, light enough to dart across battlefields, but sturdy enough to carry an archer firing volleys on. The move, in a sense, it was their version of a tank fast, terrifying, and decisive. Historians still argue whether these chariots were primarily mobile shooting platforms, or more like ancient shock cavalry. Either way, they gave Egypt an edge when properly handled. One of the bloodiest spectacles was the Battle of Megiddo under Thutmose III. Often considered the first battle recorded with reliable detail. His army marched hundreds of miles, then surprised enemies by taking a risky mountain pass. The gamble worked. The enemy panicked. Their soldiers fled, and Megiddo fell. Reliefs show neat rows of bound captives, but imagine the actual scene: horses screaming, arrows raining, warriors stumbling in blood-soaked dust. Not quite the tidy victory the temples depict. And then, of course, the famous Battle of Kadesh, where Ramses II claimed he personally routed the Hittites. The reliefs show him standing tall, his horses rearing, arrows flying like divine lightning. Reality, it was a disastrous ambush where the Egyptian army barely held together. In the end, both sides signed what is often called the first recorded peace treaty in history. Quirky detail. The treaty survives into versions, one in Egypt and one in Hattian Surprise. Each side claimed victory. Imagine to political press releases spinning the same stalemate. We totally won, ask the gods. Pharaohs weren't always in the thick of the fight, either. Some may never have lifted a weapon in earnest. Their heroic images often came from scribes' pens, not eyewitness accounts. Yet the symbolism mattered. To the people back home, seeing their king carved as taller than any enemy was enough. It wasn't about accuracy, it was about confidence, the illusion that Egypt's divine ruler guaranteed order over chaos. Still, the soldiers knew the truth. They faced hunger, wounds, and exhaustion. Archaeological finds show arrowheads lodged in bones, fractured skulls from axe blows, and scars that healed only partially. And the rewards? Payment in bread, beer, and the occasional chance at plunder. Imagine slogging hundreds of miles through desert heat for that paycheck. Here's a quirky tidbit. Egyptian armies sometimes carried portable shrines into battle, invoking divine support. Picture a squad of soldiers hauling a sacred bark alongside. The chariots, ancient morale boosters, the gods on campaign. Whether the gods swung the battle or not, the symbolism was clear. Egypt never marched alone. So, when you stare at those massive reliefs of pharaohs smiting enemies, remember that what you're seeing is less battle report and more ancient propaganda poster. Behind every neat hieroglyph, there was dust in the eyes, fear in the gut, and men who bled and died while their king's image soared. You step away from the battlefield, the clang of bronze fading into the softer sounds of clinking cups and laughter. Ahead, banquet halls glow with lamplight and strange dishes await on gilded trays. The clang of battle fades into clinking cups and the murmur of conversation. You find yourself slipping into a great banquet hall, where braziers flicker against painted ceilings and servants glide between rows of guests. With trays piled high, here is another side of Pharaoh's lives, the food, the drink, and the feasts, that carried both luxury and danger. Egyptian banquets were extravagant affairs. Imagine long tables groaning under the weight of honey cakes, roasted goose, beef stews, and baskets of figs and dates. Beer flowed by the jug, thick and hearty, brewed more like porridge than today's pint. Wine imported at great expense. From the Levant was the real luxury reserved for royals and nobles. To sip it under the gaze of a pharaoh was to taste divinity itself. Quirky tidbit. Archaeologists once found amphoe in Tutankhamun's tomb labeled not just wine, but wine, good, and even wine for the Jubilee, proof that even kings needed a sommelier's notes. But food in the palace wasn't just about indulgence, it was political theatre. When a pharaoh hosted foreign dignitaries, every dish on the table whispered a message: Egypt is wealthy, Egypt is generous, Egypt controls abundance. The honey dripping from pastries wasn't just sweet, it was symbolic of prosperity. Flowing from the Nile, the abundance of meat, a rarity for commoners, signaled divine favor. Imagine being an envoy from a smaller kingdom, staring at pyramids of bread and vats of beer, knowing your own people sometimes scraped by on lentils. That's intimidation by cuisine. Of course, with all this indulgence came risks. Historians still argue whether certain feasts might have been deadly not by curse, but by poisoning. Ancient texts hint at plots where tainted food or drink could quietly remove rivals. Was that jug of wine a peace offering or a death sentence? With so many palace intrigues swirling, paranoia surely accompanied every bite. The menu itself could be unusual to modern tastes. Egyptians enjoyed delicacies like roasted cranes, Nile perch, and even locusts. They sweetened dishes with dates and flavored them with herbs like coriander and dill. Bread came in dozens of shapes: flat loaves, conical rolls, even one stuffed with figs. But bread wasn't always a treat. The grit from stone-ground flour often left teeth worn down to painful nubs. You can almost picture a noble at a feast, smiling politely while secretly nursing toothaches from a lifetime of luxury. And the banquets could get rowdy. Some surviving texts describe music, dancing, and drinking games that sound suspiciously like frat parties. Guests were urged to drink and be merry. For tomorrow we die, not exactly the solemn dignity you expect from a pharaoh's court. Quirky detail: archaeologists have found little faience cups, inscribed with jokes, including one shaped like a woman rowing a boat of beer, proof that ancient nobles loved novelty glassware as much as your modern uncle. Yet behind the feasting lay ritual, too. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was tied to offerings for gods and the dead. Banquets often mirrored funerary rituals, reminding guests that even in the midst of indulgence, eternity loomed. Every loaf, every goose, every jar of wine was an echo of what the pharaoh expected to enjoy forever in the afterlife. So, as you sit among the revelers, the sweetness of dates on your tongue and the haze of wine warming your head, you realize this was both pleasure and propaganda. Feasts reinforced the pharaoh's role as provider, proof that he kept order and abundance flowing. But in the corner, a servant pours one cup too many and laughter grows louder, sloppier. Tomorrow's temples may carve it as divine blessing, but tonight it feels a lot like a really good party. You slip from the banquet hall, carrying the echo of laughter and the tang of wine, only to stumble into something far wilder: festivals where the entire nation drowned itself in drunken joy, all in the name of the gods. The banquet fades behind you, but the sound of music and laughter doesn't stop, it swells. You step out into open air, where torches flare along temple walls, drums thud, and the Nile glitters in the moonlight. What you've wandered into is no private feast, it's a festival. And the Egyptians didn't do festivals halfway. They threw themselves into celebration with such abandon that even the gods were said to get drunk right alongside them. Take the festival of Hathor or Sekhmet, for example. Legend said humanity was once nearly destroyed by the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, until she was tricked into drinking vats of beer dyed red to look like blood. She drank until she passed out, sparing the world. To commemorate that story, Egyptians held wild festivals where thousands of jars of beer were consumed in a single night. Imagine an entire city staggering under moonlight, laughing, dancing, and singing until dawn, or to honor the goddess who nearly wiped them out. Historians still argue whether these events were strictly religious rites, or partly controlled social release valves, a time when everyone, from farmer to noble, could cut loose together. The rituals were often ecstatic. Priests and priestesses shook cisterns, rattling instruments to invoke divine presence, while crowds swayed to music. Dancers twirled, incense curled into the night, and the beer flowed like the Nile itself. Some texts even describe deliberate intoxication as a way to commune with the gods. In other words, your tipsy uncle at a wedding reception might have been considered divinely inspired in ancient Egypt. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists uncovered remains of festival hangover cures in medical texts, including remedies with willow, a natural aspirin, and cabbage. Clearly, they knew these blowouts came with consequences. You can almost picture a scribe the morning after, head pounding, muttering, "Byra's beard. Never again," while chewing on a cabbage leaf. But these weren't just excuses to party. They reinforced the pharaoh's divine role. Festivals were staged in and around temples, and often the pharaoh was depicted as leading processions or pouring libations. In reality, priests handled much of it, but the king's presence carved on walls and recited in hymns made it clear. Abundance flowed because of him, joy flowed because of him, and even the gods danced when he gave the signal. It was political theatre wrapped in divine intoxication, and the scale was staggering. At Abydos or Thebes, processions could last for days, with sacred barks, portable shrines carried through the streets, veiled in cloth, as crowds followed, in ecstasy. Ordinary people who never glimpsed the god's image in daily temple life suddenly saw symbols of divinity paraded past their homes. For a fleeting moment, the barriers between gods, king, and commoner dissolved in music and drink. Yet, beneath the joy lay tension. Too much celebration could tip into chaos. Some scholars believe festivals served as controlled explosions moments, when normal order was suspended so society could release pressure, only to be reasserted when the hangovers cleared. Pharaohs may have smiled in the reliefs, but they knew a drunken crowd is a powerful, unpredictable thing. So, as you stand in the throng, beer scented air thick around you, music rattling your ribs, you feel a truth that no golden mask or battle relief can convey. Egyptians weren't just builders of stone. They were revelers, singers, and dancers who embraced life with abandon even while preparing for eternity. And just as the music fades into the dark, another sound creeps in, the stealthy scrape of chisels, the hushed murmurs of men who slip into tunes not to honor the dead, but to rob them. The festival drums fade, replaced by the faint scrape of chisels against stone. You follow the sound through narrow corridors until you reach a chamber, where shadows move like thieves in the night. Here lies another secret the pharaohs never wanted you to know. Their tombs, meant to guard them for eternity, were often plundered by their own people. Imagine the irony. Pharaohs spent their lives amassing treasures, gold masks, jeweled amulets, alabaster jars, lavishing wealth into their tombs so they could stride into the afterlife in style. Yet almost as soon as the stone doors were sealed, looters were already at work. Some were desperate peasants, others were members of the very priesthood sworn to protect the dead. Eternity, it turns out, had a short shelf life. We know this not just from empty tombs, but from trial records. In the reign of Ramses IX, papyri survive documenting the ** tomb robbery trials *. They read like ancient court transcripts, detailed confessions of men who broke into royal tombs, smashed coffins, stripped mummies of gold, and melted down treasures. One robber admitted, almost casually, "We took the gold, and we divided it amongst ourselves." It's disturbingly mundane, like reading the minutes of a bank heist. Historians still argue whether these robberies were driven purely by poverty, or by systemic corruption higher up the chain. And the thieves weren't amateurs. They used insider knowledge to find hidden passages, slipped through false walls, and targeted specific treasures. Some were caught, tortured, and executed, but others got away clean in some cases. Priests themselves reburied royal mummies in hidden caches, stripping them of valuables first. That's how we found the famous * Deir el-Bahari cache *. The 19th century, a secret tomb stuffed with dozens of royal mummies, hastily relocated to protect them from further looting. Among them were Seti I, Ramses II, and others, stacked like forgotten relics in a storage room of history. Here's a quirky tidbit. One mummy from such a cache, identified as Pentor, the son who conspired against Ramses III, was wrapped not in fine linen but in a rough sheepskin, an ancient act of dishonor. His distorted face suggests he died violently, likely forced to hang himself after his failed coup. Even in death, the record of his betrayal clung to him. Looting wasn't only about gold. Ordinary tombs were raided for everyday goods, jars of beer, tools, jewelry. To a poor worker, stealing a loaf of bread from a noble's tomb might have meant survival. To the pharaoh, it was an insult to the cosmic order. But in hard times, when famine struck, the lure of buried plenty was irresistible. The greatest irony, many pharaohs built elaborate traps to deter robbers, false passages, curses, sealed doors, yet none of it worked. The Valley of the Kings itself, so carefully hidden, became a honeycomb of breached chambers. When Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb, it was one of the very few left mostly intact, precisely because Tut had been a minor king quickly forgotten. His obscurity was his greatest security system still. The robbers couldn't erase everything. Even stripped, mummies carry secrets in their bones. Today, with CT scans and DNA, we can uncover details the thieves never cared about: diseases, diets, family ties. It's as if modern science is undoing the theft, restoring knowledge even when gold is long gone. You pause, listening to the imagined echoes of chisels and whispers, fading into silence. The robbed tombs stand as proof. No matter how much power pharaohs wielded, they couldn't control the living after they were gone. Their eternity was fragile, constantly under threat from human greed. And yet, as you step onward, you find another form of power the robbers couldn't strip away: the spells and amulets of magic, tucked into wrappings and carved into walls, meant to shield the dead from danger both earthly and cosmic. You leave behind the whispers of robbers and enter a chamber where the walls shimmer with carved hieroglyphs, every surface crowded with spells. Here the air feels heavier, as though words themselves carry weight. This was the pharaoh's insurance policy, the magic that bound him to eternity, protecting him from dangers both human and divine. Magic wasn't a sideshow in Egypt. It was woven into daily life. The word they used, *heka*, meant more than tricks or charms. It was the primal force used by the gods to create the world, and humans could tap into it too. For a pharaoh, magic was both shield and weapon. Without it, even the mightiest king could stumble in the afterlife. Amulets were slipped between the wrappings of mummies, each with a specific job. A scarab beetle carved from green stone was placed over the heart to prevent it from testifying against the soul at judgment. Eye of Horus amulets guarded against harm. Knots of red jasper tied to wrappings promised health. Imagine being so worried about eternity that you needed a jewelry starter pack just to get through customs at the gates of the underworld. Spells from the Book of the Dead were painted on papyri, tucked into coffins, or etched on tomb walls. They were like cheat codes for the afterlife, instructions on how to bypass demons, avoid crocodile-headed monsters, and speak the right passwords at celestial gates. One spell even told the deceased how to transform into different animals: a falcon, a lotus, a snake, depending on what form was most useful. Historians still argue whether these transformations were meant literally, spiritually, or just symbolically. Either way, it sounds like the pharaohs invented shape-shifting long before comic books. Quirky tidbit: some spells were oddly practical. One guarded against snakes in the afterlife by reciting their names aloud until they slithered away. Another protected against having to eat feces or drink urine in eternity, apparently. Even gods had to worry about bad cafeteria food. These weren't abstract fears, they were earthy, real, reflecting anxieties that cut across both kings and commoners. And magic wasn't confined to tombs. Pharaohs wore protective amulets in life too, against scorpions, illnesses, or even palace intrigue. Household shrines contained figures of bees, the squat, cheerful god who warded off evil. Priests recited incantations while brewing remedies, blending science with sorcery. A cut on your hand might get both a honey salve and a spoken charm. For Egyptians, there was no dividing line between medicine and magic. Of course, skeptics existed. Some texts mocked bad magicians who botched spells or tricked clients, and foreign travelers often exaggerated Egyptian magic into wild tales, like turning rivers into blood or animating statues. Still, the fact remains, for Egyptians, magic wasn't optional. It was as necessary as bread and beer. You linger before a painted spell that reads, "May my name be spoken, may my body be whole, may my soul go forth by day." The words are 3,000 years old, yet still legible, still echoing. In that moment, you feel the strange power of belief itself, the idea that words could outlast flesh and gold. And as the air thickens with whispered prayers, you step onward, out of the Valley of the Kings and into a different story altogether, the time when outsiders, Nubian rulers from the south, claimed the double crown of Egypt and left their own surprising legacy. The hieroglyphs fade into darkness, and when light returns, it is softer, warmer, tinged with the glow of the southern sun. You're no longer in the heart of Egypt, but standing at its edges where the Nile flows up from Nubia. Here, black African kings once rose to claim Egypt's throne, donning the double crown and ruling as pharaohs. Their dynasty, often overlooked in history books, was proof that Egypt's story was not as isolated or uniform as the golden masks suggest. These were the Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, sometimes called the Black Pharaohs. Brown. The 8th century BCE, Nubia, a neighbor, rival, and trading partner, swept north under King Pi. Instead of ravaging Egypt, Pi declared himself its rightful ruler, casting himself in inscriptions as a restorer of the cosmic order. He wasn't an outsider in his eyes, but a savior, reviving traditions Egyptians themselves had neglected. Historians still argue whether Egyptians at the time embraced or resisted this southern dynasty, but their monuments show confidence, not apology. One quirky tidbit: Pi's victory stele, discovered in Sudan, brags in mouth-watering detail about the feasts he enjoyed after conquest: horses, bread, beer, while his enemies cowered. It reads less like sober history and more like a foodie blog crossed with a flex. I ate better than you, and I took your cities. Subtle, it was not. The Nubian pharaohs didn't just conquer, they built. They left pyramids of their own at sites like El Kuru and Nuri in modern Sudan, smaller but steeper than those at Giza. You can still walk among them today, their sharp silhouettes cutting into the desert sky, remind us that Egypt's legacy spilled far beyond its traditional borders. Kings like Taharka even appear in the Bible, leading armies against Assyrians. For a time, they controlled not just Egypt, but an empire stretching deep into the Near East. Yet their reign was fragile. Assyrian invasions eventually forced the Nubians south again, and later Egyptian dynasties worked hard to erase or minimize their memory. Still, they left an imprint too deep to vanish. Quirky detail: when Taharka's statues were first uncovered in the 20th century, scholars struggled to reconcile their distinctly African features with the traditional image of Egyptian pharaohs. Some early historians, uncomfortable with the idea of black African rulers, tried to downplay or sideline their achievements. Modern archaeology, however, restores them to their rightful place, not as foreigners, but as another chapter in the long, complex weave of Egyptian kingship. What makes their story shocking isn't just that Egypt was ruled from Nubia, it's that these rulers positioned themselves as guardians of Egypt's traditions. They weren't trying to erase its culture, they were embracing and amplifying it, building temples, reviving rituals, and presenting themselves as heirs of the gods. Egypt, so often imagined as a self-contained civilization, was actually part of a wider African world connected by trade, war, and shared river. As you stand under the shadow of a Nubian pyramid, you realize the pharaoh's story is broader, richer, and more diverse than the golden masks in museums suggest. The Nile didn't end at Egypt's southern border. Its currents carried ideas, people, and power both ways. The wind tugs at your robe, carrying sand across your feet. Ahead lies another ruler whose story has been twisted for centuries, Cleopatra, whose face is more Hollywood than history, but whose true power lay in her cunning and political brilliance. The desert winds fade, and you step into a palace courtyard where the air smells faintly of rose oil and salt from the Mediterranean. The queen waits here, reclining beneath a canopy of palm leaves. Her name whispered across centuries, Cleopatra. 7. You've seen her in films, painted as a femme fatale draped in jewels, seducing Roman generals with little more than a glance. But the truth is both stranger and more fascinating. Cleopatra wasn't just a beauty. She was a strategist, a survivor, and the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy, descended from Greek rulers who had taken over Egypt after Alexander the Great. That meant she wasn't ethnically Egyptian, but she played the role with gusto. Unlike her Macedonian ancestors, she learned to speak Egyptian, styled herself as Isis reborn, and embraced the traditions of pharaonic rule. That move wasn't cosmetic, it was tactical. By embodying Egypt's divine queenhood, she secured legitimacy at home while playing high-stakes politics abroad. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony weren't simply about romance, though storytellers love to play it that way. They were about survival in a world where Rome's shadow loomed large over the Nile. With Caesar, she secured her throne against rivals, famously meeting him wrapped in a carpet or perhaps a linen sack. Historians still argue the details. With Antony, she tied Egypt's fate to his in a gamble that nearly made her queen of a Mediterranean empire. Quirky tidbit? Ancient sources say she staged elaborate floating banquets on gilded barges where Antony was, wined and dined while musicians played and servants found incense. PR meets seduction. Cleopatra was a master of both. But what about her appearance? Coins minted in her time show a sharp nose, strong jaw, and a face of authority, not the Hollywood glamour we imagine. She may not have been a conventional beauty, but her intelligence, charisma, and command of languages made her magnetic. Plutarch even wrote that her charm was less about looks and more about wit, voice, and presence. In other words, she was the kind of person who could walk into a room and bend it around her downfall came at the hands of Octavian, later Augustus, who waged not just war but a smear campaign. Roman propaganda painted her as a scheming, temptress, corrupting noble Antony, a dangerous Eastern queen leading Rome astray. The image stuck, shaping centuries of perception. Imagine being remembered not for your political maneuvers, your naval strategies, or your attempts to preserve your kingdom, but for a caricature drawn by your enemies. And then, of course, her death. The story goes she smuggled an asp into her chamber and let it bite her arm, ending her life before Octavian could parade her through Rome. Historians still debate whether that's true. Some suggest poison disguised as cosmetics might have been the real method. Whatever the case, her final act was one of defiance. Better to die a queen in her own chamber than live as a Roman. Trophy, quirky detail. When archaeologists examined her legacy, they found hints of a vast mausoleum she built with Antony in Alexandria, but its exact location remains lost beneath the modern city. Somewhere, beneath streets and apartments, the last pharaoh still waits. Cleopatra's real secret isn't seduction, it's endurance. She outmaneuvered rivals, embraced Egyptian identity more fully than many of her Greek ancestors, and nearly reshaped the political map of the ancient world. She may have been Rome's enemy, but in the eyes of her people, she was the last flicker of Egypt's ancient flame. As you leave her shadow, you step into twilight. The golden age of pharaohs is waning, yet the coffins grow ever more ornate. Ahead, the last rulers cling to splendor as their empire crumbles around them. Twilight deepens as you step into the fading years of pharaonic Egypt. The monuments are still grand, the coffins still plated with gold, but the power behind them is crumbling. Here the kings of the late period and beyond clung desperately to tradition. Even as foreign powers nibbled away at Egypt's independence, their golden coffins glittered brighter than ever. But the sparkle masked decline. Take Susan Zayev, the 21st dynasty. His silver coffin, yes, silver, Rarer than gold in Egypt was buried deep within Tanis. When archaeologists uncovered it, they found jewels, amulets, and dazzling masks, and yet Susan's ruled during a time when Egypt's political reach had shrunk to the Nile Delta. His wealth in death didn't match the thin power he held in life. Historians still argue whether this extravagance was genuine prosperity, or simply a last-ditch attempt to project divine strength. By the 26th dynasty, pharaohs like Sontic and Necho were playing balancing games with Babylon and later Persia, trying to keep Egypt relevant in a world dominated by larger empires. They revived old art styles, copying Middle and Old Kingdom motifs as if draping themselves in borrowed glory. Quirky tidbit: some late pharaohs had their names carved in archaic hieroglyphs. They could barely read themselves, like a teenager, scribbling Shakespearean English to sound impressive. The coffins themselves tell the story of this anxiety. They grew heavier with gold leaf, packed with spells, layered with protective imagery. As the world around them darkened, the Egyptians doubled down on their belief that the afterlife was still secure. Even if this world was not, it's as though, sensing political collapse, they tried to bury themselves in enough ritual armor to outlast history itself. Yet even in decline, Egypt had flashes of resilience. Kings like Nectanebo launched building projects, restoring temples in a last flowering of native rule. But his dynasty ended when Alexander the Great marched in, welcomed as a liberator. After him came the Ptolemies, Greeks on the throne, and finally the Romans. Egypt's gods still stood in stone, but the language of power had shifted. The golden coffins glittered on, but their owners ruled less as pharaohs and more as caretakers of a fading dream. Quirky detail: some of the last royal mummies, examined today, reveal shortcuts in embalming, cheap resins, sloppy wrapping. Even the craft of mummification seemed to lose precision, as if the confidence of eternity itself was waning. Contrast that with the dazzling outer coffins, and you get the full picture: an empire dressed in splendor, but hollow at the core. So when you gaze upon those gleaming sarcophagi in museums, remember they are not proof of eternal glory, but of desperate defiance. A civilization fighting against the inevitable, hiding decline under layers of gold leaf and borrowed prayers. From here, the shadows close in tighter. The tomb doors creak open not just for royalty, but for business. Priests, embalmers, and scribes turned the afterlife itself into an industry, selling eternity like a commodity. The golden coffins dim in your memory as you step into workshops thick with the smell of resin, natron, and burning incense. Here, the afterlife isn't just belief, it's business. The embalming industry of Egypt was vast, complex, and shockingly commercial. If eternity was the ultimate prize, someone had to sell you the ticket. Picture rows of embalmers in linen aprons, their hands slick with oils as they prepare bodies for mummification. Every step was ritualized, yes, but also carefully monetized. Families paid according to what they could afford: a deluxe package with gilded masks, and finely carved coffins, or a bargain option with plain wrappings and recycled wood. Think of it as the world's first tiered service plan: bronze, silver, and gold packages for the dead. Historians still argue whether this was driven by sincere piety or savvy economics. But either way, the dead kept the priests busy. The asterisk Herodotus Papyrus asterisk describes the menu of options. The premium version involved removing the brain through the nose, replacing organs with aromatic resins, and wrapping the body in fine linen with amulets slipped between the layers. Cheaper methods might skip some steps, sometimes leaving the body barely preserved. Archaeologists have found mummies where the embalming was little more than hot resin, poured into the body, sealing it like a grim toffee apple. Quirky tidbit: at Saqqara, excavations uncovered a complex that seems to have functioned like a mortuary showroom. Different oils, resins, and wrappings were stored in labeled jars, suggesting grieving families could literally browse embalming options. Imagine walking into a funeral home where the salesman leans in, "For just a few extra devons, we can guarantee your loved one's soul won't have to eat dung in the afterlife." The priests controlled this trade, and with it, immense wealth. They weren't just guardians of temples, they were businessmen running an economy of eternity. Fees from embalming funded their rituals, their estates, and even political power. By the later dynasties, priests often rivaled pharaohs in influence, all thanks to their monopoly on preparing the dead. For the ordinary Egyptian, this system offered comfort. Even if you couldn't afford gold leaf, you could still secure spells, amulets, and basic embalming. The belief that every person deserved a shot at eternity democratized the afterlife, provided you had the right priest to pay. But it also created a darker side. Mummies have been found with reused wrappings, missing amulets, or even swapped identities. Were these mistakes, or deliberate cost-cutting by embalmers pocketing the difference? Historians still debate whether corruption was common or only occasional. One haunting discovery: a mass burial shaft at Saqqara contained hundreds of embalmed animals, and people, stacked together, sold as offerings or low-cost burials. For some, eternity was crowded and impersonal, more warehouse than paradise. The contrast with gilded royal tombs couldn't be sharper. Yet through it all, the rituals themselves remained deeply spiritual. Every cut, every binding, every spoken word was meant to preserve not just flesh but identity. Even in a bustling workshop, priests recited prayers to Anubis, asking him to guide the soul safely through the afterlife's perils. To Egyptians, the business of death was also the business of hope. So, as you stand amid jars of cedar oil and rolls of linen, you realize that Egypt's most enduring export wasn't just gold or monuments, it was eternity itself, wrapped, priced, and sold. And now, with so many bodies prepared and laid to rest, it's time to let modern science peel back the bandages again, using CT scans and DNA to reveal secrets the embalmers never expected to be exposed. You step into a room not filled with incense and chanting, but the quiet hum of modern machines. Here, eternity is no longer guarded by priests but probed by CT scanners, DNA labs, and microscopes. Pharaohs and commoners alike, wrapped thousands of years ago, now find themselves under the cool gaze of science, their secrets slowly coaxed. From brittle bones and desiccated flesh, take Ramses II, once celebrated in colossal statues. His mummy tells a very different story. CT scans revealed arthritis twisting his spine, abscesses plaguing his teeth, and hardened arteries that may have made his final years agonizing. For all his claims of godhood, Ramses spent his old age shuffling painfully, probably cranky enough to smite anyone who mentioned it. Historians still argue whether his towering monuments were reflections of strength or overcompensation for a body that was slowly betraying him. Then there's Seqenenre, a king from the 17th dynasty. His skull is a battlefield of wounds. Axe blows, punches, fractures. CT imaging showed he was likely executed on his knees, a prisoner of Hyksos invaders. His embalming was rushed, sloppy, almost disrespectful, suggesting his death was sudden and humiliating. Imagine the difference between his temple relief king smiting enemies and the reality. A man clubbed down, his skull crushed like any other soldier's. Tutankhamun, of course, continues to spill secrets. DNA studies confirmed his lineage, revealing the tangled web of sibling parents and fragile offspring. They also found traces of malaria in his system, making him the oldest known case of the disease. CT scans showed a clubfoot, scoliosis, and fractures, though historians still debate whether those came from an accident, an attack, or even botched mummification. Quirky tidbit: one study suggests parts of his body may have been accidentally burned by a chemical reaction during burial. So the boy king's afterlife may have begun in flames, an outcome no priest would have dared to predict. And it's not just kings. Scans of ordinary mummies reveal parasitic worms coiled in intestines, clogged arteries, dental decay from bread full of stone grit. For all their grandeur, Egyptians suffered the same aches and illnesses as us, sometimes worse. Yet these very flaws help modern medicine track the evolution of diseases. Malaria, tuberculosis, even arteriosclerosis leave traces in these ancient bodies, offering doctors time capsules of pathology. One quirky discovery: Researchers once found that a mummy's vocal cords, preserved enough, could be digitally reconstructed, with air pumped through a 3D printed replica of the throat. The mummy spoke again, though all it managed was a short, awkward vowel sound. Imagine spending eternity to be resurrected, not as a kingly orator, but as a single, ghostly heir. Historians still debate how much weight to give these scientific findings compared to traditional archaeology. Bones and DNA provide hard facts, but interpreting them requires caution. A fracture might mean violence or clumsy handling by ancient embalmers. A parasite might suggest illness or a contaminated sample. Yet even with debates, one thing is clear: the pharaohs are no longer silent. There's something oddly poetic about it. Priests once whispered spells to guide the dead through the underworld. Now scientists whisper into microphones, interpreting CT slices and genetic markers. Different rituals, same goal: to pull meaning from silence to understand the people behind the masks. You step back, hearing the soft hum of machines fade into quiet again. Beyond the glass and data, beyond the DNA strands, lies the final truth. Even with all this knowledge, the last mystery of the pharaohs is not what they left behind, but how their voices echo into eternity. And now, as you turn the last corner, you come face to face with the fading silence of gods themselves, broken tombs, vanished prayers, and the long, slow hush of Egypt's forgotten eternity. You turn the last corner and the torches gutter low. The air cools, heavy with centuries of silence. Here, the journey ends not in glittering gold, not in booming hymns, but in the quiet presence of broken tombs. Shards of coffins lie scattered, hieroglyphs half faded, the gods' painted eyes dulled by time. This is the final resting silence of the pharaohs, where eternity itself seems fragile. You walk past mummies once swaddled in the certainty of forever, now exposed to the eyes of strangers in glass cases. For all their masks, amulets, and spells, the pharaohs couldn't escape history's erosion. Their temples fell, their names were erased, their gods forgotten by most of the world. The afterlife they prepared for so meticulously was not quite the one they entered. Eternity proved more unpredictable than even the asterisk book of the dead asterisk could script. And yet there's power in the silence. Every broken sarcophagus whispers of human ambition, of desperate hope. Even stripped tombs hold weight, not because of their lost gold, but because they remind us how fiercely people fought to defy death, in their own way. The pharaohs succeeded. Thousands of years later, we still speak their names, still study their bones, still marvel at their audacity. Maybe immortality doesn't require the gods at all, just memory. Historians still argue whether Egypt's obsession with eternity was brilliance or folly. But as you stand here in this hush of stone and sand, the truth feels less about debate and more about perspective. The pharaohs wanted to be gods. What they became were stories. Perhaps that's an afterlife as enduring as any paradise. Quirky tidbit: one forgotten pharaoh, Senebkay, was discovered only in 2014 in a tomb plundered long ago. His coffin wood was stolen, his name almost erased. Yet modern archaeologists pieced him back together, giving him a voice again after 3 millennia. It's a reminder that even broken, forgotten rulers can still return to history's stage. You close your eyes and listen. No curses, no hymns, just the faint hum of memory. The journey through masks, bones, beauty tricks, curses, wars, feasts, and festivals settles into stillness. The gods may have faded, but their echoes remain, carried in every whisper of sand. Across the Nile. Now the story softens, like torchlight dimming into candle glow. You step away from the tombs, leaving behind the heavy stone doors, the crumbling hieroglyphs, and the painted eyes that no longer watch. The desert air cools as night settles in, the vast sky spilling with stars that once guided priests and kings alike. Their ambitions, their secrets, their flaws all fade into the hush of eternity. You walk slower now, your steps sinking gently into the sand. The noise of festivals, the clash of chariots, the whispers of conspirators all melt away until only silence remains. The pyramids in the distance no longer look like monuments of ego or power. They stand quiet, like mountains asleep under the moon. Timeless and calm, The pharaohs dreamed of eternity, but what they left us is something even more human. Reminders of fragility, hope, and a yearning to be remembered. Their masks gleamed, their coffins glittered, but beneath it all, they were people who laughed, suffered, schemed, and loved just as we do. That truth is gentler than any curse and softer than any hymn dots, so breathe deep. Let the last grains of sand slip through your fingers. The journey through Egypt's secrets has ended, and the noise of history is replaced by the quiet rhythm of your own breath. As the stars shimmer above, you can rest easy knowing that even the mightiest kings must yield to time. And if their memory still lingers after thousands of years, then perhaps there is comfort in knowing that stories even yours can echo longer than stone. Now let your eyes grow heavy. Let the desert winds hush you to sleep and drift slowly into dreams.